was an applause for Leonard, of course. Well, there are a lot of things you probably already know about Rich Applebaum. You probably know him as a distinguished and accomplished campus citizen, former chair of the sociology department, director of ISPER, and the head of this institute, Social Science Research Institute, during one of its most prodigious periods of growth. You know him as one of the founders of the Global and International Studies program and one of the founders of the Global Studies major, which has now grown to over 450 students in less than 2 years. You know him as an accomplished author, as a social theorist, as a scholar of political economy, and the author of one of the best-known and best-selling textbooks in sociology in the field, which is, in addition to being a useful book in the classroom, a major step forward in the globalization of the field of sociology, because in this introductory book he presents the fields of sociology in a global fashion. Now, all of this you probably already know. What you may not know is that Professor Applebaum is something of a social activist, as well as an accomplished scholar and campus leader. He not only thinks about and studies issues of global change and the impact of the labor market, he is concerned about it and concerned about the way that it impacts the lives of people who are affected by these forms of economic globalization. It's this social action concern that has led him into participation in a campus-wide committee on the use of the UC label by firms that may be using unfair labor practices in different parts of the world, that has led him to an involvement in a sweatshop labor committee in Los Angeles that's concerned about the way in which Los Angeles-based textile corporations have used labor in the Los Angeles area and around the world. It's this social action concern combined with this intellectual interest that has led to this remarkable book, Behind the Label, which involves a collaboration of Professor Edna Bonacic at the University of California, Riverside, a team of graduate students who are interested not only in the intellectual issues with regard to the globalization of the labor force, but also the way that this impacts people's lives. This is socially sensitive scholarship, which is a part of Professor Applebaum that I think brings a lot of pride to us, as well as appreciation for its intellectual accomplishments. It's a remarkable book. It happens to be on sale at the back of the room at the end of the period. It makes, I understand, a wonderful gift for Christmas, for Hanukkah, for Buddha's birthday. Ramadan is only shortly past. There are a number of wonderful events coming up for which it's just the ideal gift to be signed by the author, makes it especially appropriate, and he'll be glad to do that. Now, there's one other list among that I haven't told you. These are the things you probably don't know about Professor Applebaum. You probably don't know that he's a mountain trekker, probably don't know that he prefers boxer shorts, and that he is currently involved in mountain climbing lessons. And that's probably as much of this list that I'm going to go into, but it demonstrates that he's a man of remarkable interest and talents, and we're proud to introduce Professor Richard Applebaum.
Only Mark could give an introduction like that. It was correct in almost every respect except the part about boxer shorts. I don't know where you got that idea. Mark has covered much of what I wanted to say, so I think we'll just proceed over to the book signing part of this. Actually, I do appreciate that introduction because it does tie into something which I will emphasize in my brief remarks, which is that I do believe that scholarship should be engaged. It shouldn't be detached. And one of the wonderful things about this book, the project involved in it, is that it drew me in to a number of things which I think are important, which have given a lot of meaning to my life and which I will share with you in these remarks. Just to sort of set the stage for this, if you think back about 5 years, You may recall picking up the Los Angeles Times, as people did around the country, to read about slavery in Los Angeles. In El Monte, which is part of the Los Angeles metro area, 71 women, primarily young women from Thailand, were found to be working in a situation of indentured servitude, semi-slavery. They had paid something like $5,000 each for passage to the United States, illegally, of course, in hopes of realizing their dreams, in hopes of escaping the lives of poverty, AIDS, prostitution, which many young women in Thailand confront. And when they got to Los Angeles, their passports were taken away. They were spirited to a housing complex in El Monte, surrounded by accordion wire fence, high walls, and there they stayed, some of them as long as 6 years. They are required to buy their provisions in the company store at inflated prices. They were paid virtually nothing. They slept on the floor among the garments that they sewed, and they just simply sunk deeper into poverty. When eventually one of them escaped, went to the Migration Service, the U.S. government was going to deport them, except for the efforts of a wonderful young attorney that works for an Asian American Defense Center in Los Angeles, Julie Su, who took up their cause, enabled them to stay in the United States, and got them a settlement. That slave shop became the centerpiece of an exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, which later moved to Los Angeles. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. What was remarkable about the El Monte slave shop is that the clothing that hung on the hangers there sold in places like Montgomery Ward, Neiman Marcus, and other major retailers in the United States. That tells us, in a sense, a lot about the global economy today. None of those retailers said, let's find a slave shop in Los Angeles where we can force young women from Thailand to work at $2 or $3 an hour for 72-hour weeks. What those retailers did was they went to licensed contractors in Los Angeles. Contractors, in fact, factories that were part of an extensive monitoring program in the city of Los Angeles. And they placed their orders there. And then those contractors turned out to be a front shop for this sweatshop, slave shop in El Monte. Now, this is an extreme case, but this describes, in many ways, what I learned and experienced in the 10 years that I was doing research in Los Angeles. What I'd like to do is tell a few stories. I'd like to tell you how I came to do the book, because I think that's important. I want to tell you a little about the structure of the book, some of its major findings, what can be done, and I'd like to read you a few passages from the book along the way. And I have 4 or 5 graphs to show you also. I can't resist being a professor to put up some overheads. So how did I come to do the book? I had been studying global production systems for about 5 years. And my research had taken me to Asia, where I traced out the supply chains of American firms, trying to understand how companies could produce in this age of information 12,000 miles away, how they could have their head offices in one place and their factories halfway around the world. I went to a lot of factories, clothing and electronics factories in China, Vietnam, Hong Kong. And what I came to learn was that the conditions in those factories, some were good, some were bad, but I didn't have to go halfway around the world to find factories or to find sweatshops. All I had to do is take the 101 freeway 100 miles south, get off, go to 11th and Los Angeles Street, where the California Apparel Mart is located, walk in any direction, and I would be led to a Central American town full of Spanish-speaking people working at minimum or sub-minimum wages, into tiny factories crammed into buildings that had been designed to hold offices and which had now been subdivided into warrens of factories, tiny factories employing maybe 30 people each. When I first went down there, I was amazed. I'll share my first experience with you. I went with a colleague, Gary Gireffi from Duke University, my very first factory interview about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And someone had given us the name of this factory, had a contact, so we drove up to this old rundown building. It had seen its glory days years ago, and got into the elevator. That was an experience. There were no lights in the elevator, and there was no door on the elevator. And off we went up 5 floors in pitch darkness. It was really quite a terrifying experience. Then we got off the elevator and went into this factory, which was just packed with people, occupying an office size that was meant maybe for a half a dozen employees. There are probably 35 people there. That factory was repeated around this floor in this building. There was one bathroom serving this floor, and that bathroom was overflowing with human excrement because it was not meant to serve 10 factories with 30 workers each. It was meant to serve a handful of offices. That was my first introduction to Los Angeles. I teamed up with Edna Bonacic, who Mark mentioned. Edna is a sociologist at the University of California at Riverside. She is a very senior sociologist in the University of California system. She is the author of the Split Labor Market Theory. She's done major research on immigrant entrepreneurs, and she is a die-hard rabble-rouser. In our collaboration, I was the nice cop to her bad cop. It was a wonderful teamwork. I'll tell you one Edna story. Edna came to my department, sociology, a couple of years ago to give a talk. And she wore a red and black Unite t-shirt with a fist and bread and roses on it, and urged our graduate students to drop out of school and get engaged. So I had to do major damage control after that. Edna was a wonderful collaborator. The vision that I brought to the project was an interest in globalization. And I initially wanted to structure it around my own world systems framework, which is a particular framework that studies the global economy. And Edna said we should structure it around themes of inequality rather than some highfalutin theory about the global economy. And as in many things, she was right. And when I run through the structure of the book, I'll show you how the structure reflects that interest. We had many high points of collaboration, one of which I'll share with you in a minute. Edna, I should also say, was working with the International Lady Garments Union, Workers Union. Even though she was a senior academic at the University of California, the union did not trust her because they don't trust academics, rightfully, because academics come in, do their research, and leave. So Edna, for years, had done volunteer work at the Justice Center in downtown Los Angeles, providing advice and help and research, primarily research, for the union and for garment workers. And by the time I began working with her, she had gained the confidence of the union. So she was really the union connection and very much interested in what the union could do. Mark mentioned that my work as activist. Let me say a word about that before I move on to the book. This research led to a number of projects which I feel very good about. One of them was the one Mark mentioned, the Los Angeles Jewish Commission on Sweatshops. I teamed Edna up with some other people, and we connected up with the leading rabbis of Reform Judaism in Los Angeles. We created a commission. We invented it out of whole cloth. We announced we were going to hold public hearings, and much to our surprise, over a one-year period, everybody came to those hearings. All the leading manufacturers in Los Angeles, the retailers, the factory owners, the union, garment workers, all the top state labor officials, which just kind of goes to show, I think, if you're brazen enough, as I said to my honors class, it's like we threw a party and everybody came, much to our surprise. That was part of this research, and the commission has led to some ongoing activities that I'll touch on. I'm also involved with the student anti-sweatshop movement. I'm on the advisory council of the Worker Rights Consortium, which is a national organization which includes 65 universities, including the entire University of California system, which is seeking to implement and enforce the codes of conduct which the University of California and others have adopted in the last 2 years in response to student pressures to try to gain some control over the production of sweatshirts that say UCSB or Cal or UCLA. Okay, let me say a little bit about the project itself and the book. The project took 10 years to complete. It was, as we say in the business, a multi-method project. We tried pretty much every type of research possible. We involved a dozen or more students, some postdoc students, lots of grad students, some undergraduates. We interviewed people at all levels of the industry. Early on, before we became persona non grata in the industry, Edna and I, we talked to the leading manufacturers and retailers and bankers and the people at the top end of the industry. We interviewed the Contractors Association, that is the factories associations, the Korean Association, the Spanish one, the Latino one. We talked to workers, union members, government officials, heads of the fashion schools. We tried to do a complete survey of the garment district. The methods we used ranged from participation. Greg Scott, one of my students, rode around on food trucks that went from factory to factory, worked with a garment worker to spend time in focus groups and in-depth interviews. We did scientifically representative surveys that were analyzed statistically. One of the top 200 manufacturers, all those with sales of $10 million or more. And we did a survey of 100 Korean factory owners, since the Koreans are the largest group of factory owners, which was done by a Korean graduate student. We developed computerized maps of Los Angeles and did pretty much everything. In fact, let me describe the kind of high point, personally, of this research experience was when Edna and I were invited by the Morse family, which owned the California Apparel Mart at the time. They since were fired, but the Mart had been in their family. The Mart, by the way, are these 4 towers in downtown Los Angeles with 1,500 showrooms for all the local manufacturers. The Morse family invited us to sit at their table at the fundraising event for the Fashion Industry Guild of Cedars-Sinai Hospital. Edna and I were studying the power elite, as we called it. We didn't tell the Morse family that. We just told them that we were interested in knowing how people in the industry thought, which was true. And one way the power elite operates is through philanthropy. And so all the major hospitals and organizations have guilds which raise money aimed at particular segments of the community. The Fashion Industry Guild for Cedars-Sinai's Hospital raised money by targeting the garment industry. This particular year, they're honoring Jonathan Bernstein. I rented a tuxedo. Edna bought, I think at Kmart actually, a formal gown. Her gown did not pass muster, I must say, with the well-attired people from the fashion industry, but everyone was very cordial to us. And it was a wonderful evening where I learned a lot. And the only embarrassing moment was during dinner when we're all drinking and I'm hobnobbing with the heads of all the major Los Angeles labels. And they start to talk, and Edna whipped out her notebook and started taking notes. I thought that was a little gauche on her part, but it didn't slow her down. The way the book is organized, just a word on that, we divided it into 3 sections. And this will not surprise anybody. Capital, labor, and fighting back, which tells you something about the thrust of the book also. The section on capital covers topics such as offshore production. It locates the LA industry within the context of the global garment industry. It includes a chapter on retailers and a chapter on manufacturers. The chapter on labor includes not only the section on labor, the part of the book on labor includes not only chapters on garment workers, but also on contractors, because we include the factory owners in the same category as the workers. And that is because, as I'm going to illustrate in a moment, in this industry, as well as in much of global production today, the people who actually run the factories are not the people who profit from production. The manufacturers and retailers place orders with independently owned factories, and in Los Angeles, those factories, in many cases, are just one step above the people who work in them. So we combine the factory owners with the workers. And then in the final section of the book, Fighting Back, we talk about the unionization efforts and why they failed. We talk about various other community efforts that are going on, and we talked about the student anti-sweatshop movement. Okay, let me give you just some highlighted findings from the book. First finding, garment production is central to the Los Angeles economy. By various indications, it accounts for as much as 10% of the $300 billion economy of the Southland. Now that is astounding because you think of Los Angeles as a manufacturing center, as a center of Hollywood and imagery, but the garment industry is a mainstay of the economy. It employs 160,000 people, 120,000 of whom are sewing machine operators, mainly seamstresses, mainly women. It involves roughly 6,000 to 7,000 tiny factories spread out all over Los Angeles, except of course on the west side of Los Angeles. It accounts for 1 out of every 5 manufacturing jobs in Los Angeles County. At a time nationally when employment in apparel has been plummeting, it's been exploding in Los Angeles up until the last year or so when it has leveled off. During the 5 years or so that we studied it, employment grew by something like 1/3 in Los Angeles. And one of the things we try to do is understand why is Los Angeles so strong, and it has to do partly with the presence of a low-wage immigrant undocumented community, but it also has to do with Los Angeles' unique characteristics as a center of fashion design and industry. The image is there, the California look, the active sportswear image that the Los Angeles industry celebrates. There are fashion schools there. There's design for Hollywood. There are stylists there. There are sewing schools there. There's everything within a tiny area, which needs to create a vibrant fashion district, in addition, of course, to the workers. And the workers are, as I said, largely immigrant from Mexico and Central America, and mainly without documents. So the fashion industry is central to the LA economy. Second point is that it is a sweatshop industry. In our research, the average seamstress in Los Angeles earned about $7,000 to $8,000 a year, which is about 2/3 of minimum wage. Now that's somewhat deceiving because the work is sporadic. It's hard to know how much workers are paid. Officially, they're paid the minimum wage, but the various unannounced sweeps that are done by the Labor Department repeatedly finds that workers are not paid the minimum wage. Workers average $150 a week in this industry. They are paid by the piece. That is to say, they are paid based on how many pieces they can sew in an hour. The problem with piece rate is, on the one hand, it provides an incentive for workers to be efficient, productive, they can earn more money. On the other hand, it provides a unique opportunity for exploitation because, as we are told repeatedly in our research, as workers became more efficient, the piece rate was dropped. To give you one example, in California, whether you are paid by the piece or the hour, you have to be paid minimum wage. During one 18-month period that we are doing our research, the minimum wage in Los Angeles went up by 35% because of national and then state mandated increases. But the piece rate did not go up for workers at all. It stayed the same. This led one worker to say that raising the minimum wage was a punishment for workers, because when the minimum wage went up, the only way that factory owners could afford to pay them was to make them work faster, so they would produce more pieces to make the higher minimum wage. It had a perverse result. We found that 2 out of every 3 factories in Los Angeles have violations of wage and hour laws. We found that 96% of all factories in Los Angeles have California Occupational Safety and Health, OSHA violations. And while some of those are trivial, half of those, according to the state OSHA director, were severe enough to endanger life and limb. Large machines without safeguards, fire exits blocked with clothing, things of that sort. So it is a sweatshop industry. That was our second finding. First finding, it is a mainstay of the economy. Second finding, it is a sweatshop industry. Third finding is that it is a rabidly anti-union industry that plays hardball with people who disagree with it. The industry has fought unionization at every turn. Just to give you one anecdote, Guess Jeans, which is the largest manufacturer in Los Angeles, or was at the time of our study, had been repeatedly cited by the National Labor Relations Board for harassing the International Lady Garment Workers Union's efforts to unionize its shops. And Christmas, 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, the National Labor Relations Board told Guess that they had to reinstate, I think, 4 workers that they had fired for the union organizing activities and pay them back wages. By the way, the consequences for this are minimal. All you got to do is pay the back wages. And so Guess, with much fanfare, announced that they were not culpable. They admitted no wrongdoing, but they did reinstate the 4 workers. And then, with no fanfare, 2 weeks later, just before Christmas, Guess proceeded to move 2/3 of its production to Tehuacan, Mexico, where the workers, I went to Tehuacan with a human rights group, where the workers labor behind in these enormous factories surrounded by multi-story walls with cyclone fencing on the top and armed guards, where nobody is going to go in and examine labor conditions. Let me just give you one other story about how the industry plays hardball. This is not from the book specifically, but is from the work I did with the Los Angeles Jewish Commission on Sweatshops. The Commission on Sweatshops was a creature of something called the American Jewish Congress. The American Jewish Congress is one of 2 major national Jewish organizations. The Los Angeles branch of the American Jewish Congress had been around for 20 years or so, and it took on as one of its projects the commission. It provided us with staffing, and one of the commission's co-chairs, Carol Levy, was head of the American Jewish Congress in Los Angeles, in Southern California. When our report came out 2 years ago now, Carol appeared on Life and Times, which is a television show, and she debated Ilsa Metchek, head of the Fashion Industry Association. Ilsa spoke on behalf of the fashion industry. Carol spoke summarizing the results of the commission's research, which reflect a lot of the research that Edna and I had done. Within 5 days of Carol's appearing on Los Angeles television, the Los Angeles branch of the American Jewish Congress was shut down. Its board of trustees was fired. Its 3 employees, including Carol, were given 1 week to get out of their office and were fired. The reason that was given was that the American Jewish Congress had not raised enough money. The truth of the matter was that John Heffer, who was head of the finance committee of the National American Jewish Congress organization, who sent the notice to Carol that she was fired, also turned out to be a vice president of Republic National Bank, based in New York City, and turned out to be president of a subsidiary of Republic National Bank called the Republic Business Credit Corporation, which has its offices at 1000 Wilshire Boulevard, and which makes $5 billion worth of loans, actually factor loans, what are called factor loans to the industry. And it was pretty obvious, I think. This merited a small article by Bob Shearer in the LA Times, but not too much attention. But there was immediate retaliation for the research. Okay, let me mention the third finding, which that there are enormous disparities in wealth in the industry. And here I actually have some slides I want to talk about briefly. Here is your sexy sparkle dress from Guess, made with nylon and spandex. I pulled this off their website. So sparkles in the light, stretchy, sexy, and fitted through the waist. Is there anyone in this room who's wearing one of these who'd care to model it for us? You are, thank you. Just to give you an idea, I chose this dress because it retails for $100 in, say, Nordstrom's. Of that $100, the retailer gets $50 to cover the retailer's expenses, the cost of running a department store chain, so on and so forth. The manufacturer gets $50. The manufacturer is Guess Jeans. They design this dress. Of that $50, well, I'll kind of cut through here in the interest of time, but the bottom line is that $6 goes to the worker if this dress is made in Los Angeles. So of the $100 you put on your credit card when you go into Nordstrom's and buy this dress, $6 winds up in the pocket of the seamstress who made it, if it is made in Los Angeles. If this dress is made in Mexico, it's more like 60 cents. Now, I want you to bear this in mind, because when you hear that labor costs are forcing the industry offshore, you can always ask the question, well, why will a few more pennies at the bottom end make such a big difference at the top end? Let's look at the other end of the supply chain, which is at the top. These statistics are from about 3 years ago when we developed them for our book. The chief executive officers of the 60 publicly traded retailers that specialize in apparel several years ago averaged $1.5 million a year in salaries and compensation. This does not include stock options and things of that sort. If you look at the publicly traded apparel manufacturers, those are retailers on top. The manufacturers average $2 million a year. My favorite statistic is this one here. In 1997, if you looked at the most highly compensated apparel executives in Los Angeles, 5 out of 6 were associated with the Guess Corporation. The 4 Marciano brothers who own Guess, plus I think their chief financial officer. They took home in that year, this does not count the stock options they exercised, which were worth $180 million. They took home $12.6 million, which is enough to double the wages of 1,700 Los Angeles workers. Now, far be it from me to argue that, well, no, let me rephrase that. I will argue that this is unconscionable. When the industry pleads poverty and says, if I don't cut my wages by going offshore, my competitors will and I'll be out of business, the question is, why do you have to have a house in France and a house in Los Angeles and Brentwood and so on and so forth? How much is enough? I think it is right to raise an ethical issue. One of the things I learned on the Los Angeles Jewish Commission on Sweatshops, hanging around with a bunch of rabbis and working in concert with a bunch of priests and ministers, is that it is okay to take an ethical position. Academics try to stay away from having opinions on things. The other graph that I want to put up is this one, and I want to spend a minute talking about it because this, in a way, is our major finding. This is the structure of the industry in Los Angeles, and this graph illustrates why it is so difficult to solve the problem in the industry. And this, I think, is a microcosm also of other industries in the global economy today. So let me walk you through this a little bit. This is a pyramid of power. This is an example of what in my line of work we call a buyer-driven supply chain. This is a production network which is controlled by retailers. At the top of the apparel industry sit giant retailers. Just to give you one statistic, I'll give you 2 statistics on this actually. One statistic is that 4 retail conglomerates in the United States account for 2 out of every 3 retail dollars. Walmart, Kmart, Sears, and Target. Walmart, whose sales this past year totaled $165 billion, is larger than the economies of all but 22 countries. So when these retail concerns say, we will pay so much wholesale for this jacket, the manufacturer who designs this jacket says, okay. You have to have enormous label brand name recognition to fight with retailers. There was enormous retail consolidation in the United States in the late 1980s and early 1990s, bankruptcies, leveraged buyouts, and this concentration at the top resulted. So retailers place orders with manufacturers. Now, manufacturers, The very name is misleading in the economy today. To manufacture something means to make something. But manufacturers do not make anything. They design and they market. The days when a garment manufacturer employed 1,000 workers in his or her factory are long gone. What the manufacturers do is they design clothing, they figure out how to merchandise it, they sell it to retailers, they create brand name recognition, like Guess Jeans did by turning models such as Gloria Schiffer into superstars. But they don't actually make the clothing. The clothing is made at this level. These are what are called in Los Angeles contractors. They are called contractors because they are contract shops that hire out for labor. These are independently owned factories. And so when Guess places an order with Mr. Young's factory for so many jeans, so Guess can sell those jeans in Nordstrom's, this whole level is completely separate. There is a divide here. There is no legal accountability between these levels. Each manufacturer places orders with multiple factories. Among the 200 largest manufacturers, the average number was 18 different factories in Los Angeles. Each contractor hedges its bets, taking orders from different manufacturers. It is the contractors that employ the 120,000 seamstresses. Handful of retailers, maybe 1,200 manufacturers in Los Angeles, of which a dozen account for most sales. 6,000 factories, 120,000 workers. This number is not correct. 120,000 workers. A pyramid of power in which the people at the top place the orders downward. This results in a squeeze, and the only place where the squeeze cannot be avoided is at the bottom. And so when retailers compete with one another, squeezing manufacturers, they then push down, and the result is sweatshops. The system itself produces sweatshops. And let me just say two other things about this graph. One is that if this looks confusing, it's because it is designed to be confusing. It is impossible when you buy a garment to know the factory in which it was made. These lines are invisible, and that removes the onus of moral, not to say legal responsibility, from the top end of this pyramid. You know, you can never really know unless you do major detective work. Second thing I want to say about this graph is that in a uniquely Los Angeles fashion, there is a kind of sociological component to it that has to do with ethnicity. The retailers at the top are white. The manufacturers are white and Jewish, largely. The factory owners are immigrant entrepreneurs, primarily Koreans. Koreans account for about half of the employment because they own the largest factories, and then also Mexicans and some Central Americans, and the workers are almost all Latinos. And so this creates a pretty volatile chemistry. And what it does is it shields these people from these people. The Latino workers hate their Korean bosses. They describe them as brutal. I was going to read you some things. I won't have time to do that, but the animosity is mutual. The Korean factory owners regard the Latino workers as lazily, irresponsible, and so on. When you ask why are there sweatshops, the contractors point their finger upward at the manufacturers. The manufacturers point their fingers upward at the retailers and downward at the factory owners and say it's those Koreans. They don't share our values. They just like to exploit people. But it's my analysis that the problems are systemic. Competition at the top squeezes everything at the bottom. I realize that we are running out of time. So let me, I was going to read some things from the book, but I won't do that. Instead, let me just say a few words about what I think can be done about this, and then take any questions you might have and do some book signing. What can be done? Well, the first thing that has to be done is people have to be educated. They have to understand how the system works. The second thing is that people have to come to believe that they can make a difference, and they have made a difference. In the collegiate sector, for example, students are going to buy that UCSB sweatshirt, if it costs $30 or $31 because they want the UCSB sweatshirt. And so in campuses around the country, students have put pressure on their administrations, in many cases through sit-ins, to the point where 200 universities or so around the country have adopted codes of conduct which specify the following. First, that any garment which bears the logo of the campus, the workers be paid a living wage, enough to live on. Secondly, that the names and addresses of all factories be made public. And thirdly, that those factories be open to on-site inspection. And fourthly, that women employees not be harassed. They are given pregnancy tests, for example, in many Central American factories and in Mexico and fired. And there are a number of other demands, but you get the picture. It is to open this up, to explode it, to create a system of accountability. 1 year ago, Nike, which is a major manufacturer for campuses, about a fifth of Nike sales are not in running shoes, but in logoed items on campuses. 1 year ago, pressure was put on Nike to go public with the factories that it used around the world to make its collegiate goods. And Nike said, it'll destroy us. It'll put us out of business. It'll give away our trade secrets. We can't do it. Under pressure, Nike turned around, and now you can go to their website, and you can find the addresses and the names of every factory that's used in collegiate production. So small steps are being made. One final comment. If you are interested in becoming involved in this, it's not enough to do your own personal statement, as important as that may be. It has to be concerted pressure on leading manufacturers aimed not at boycotts, because boycotts hurt the workers ultimately, but getting manufacturers such as the Gap to upgrade their conditions, their working conditions. And I will put up here to conclude some useful context. The best place to go is Sweatshop Watch. Their website contains links to every other organization. And on this campus, there is something called the Campus Labor Action Coalition, which meets, I think, at 5 o'clock on Wednesdays. And if you're interested, contact me, and I'll tell you how to join it. Okay, well, thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And we actually have a microphone we can put you on so your voice will be recorded. Any questions? In the back there.
Do you care to comment on the role of the INS in all of this, and immigration legislation, enforcement of immigration restriction legislation, looking the other way? What do you see as the role of the INS in all of this?
Right, the INS has played an extremely destructive role in all this. And one of the interesting things that I learned was that the Labor Department, which tries to protect workers, is constantly coming up against the INS. And I think, to its credit, the Labor Department, at least during the Clinton administration, and the people who staffed the office in Southern California, really tried not to divulge information to the INS. Under U.S. labor laws, I think, technically you can complain, and that remains a private issue. The INS tried immediately to deport those Thai workers and was prevented from doing so. And it is the strong anti-immigration laws in combination with 1 million undocumented workers in Los Angeles that has created this relatively defenseless pool of low-wage employees. So, I think it's hard to organize workers into unions if they're afraid that if they call attention to themselves, they'll be deported immediately.
When you were analyzing what you saw as sort of the root causes of this situation, you referred to it as a systemic problem. And yet, obviously, you didn't have time at the end to develop all the suggestions you would make for how people could understand and work to improve the situation. But it seemed like the suggestions you made may not have attacked it at a systemic level. And I'm wondering if you can say something further about that.
Let me give you a semi-evasive answer because I really don't know what the answer is. From a certain sense, the problem seems overwhelming. So let me tell you what I think. I think that the world economy is undergoing a transition from production based in countries under one roof and large factories these global supply networks that I've described, where manufacturers can shift their production around the globe with ease. And under those conditions, it is very hard to organize workers into unions, because any effort to unionize a factory anywhere in the world will simply lead the manufacturer, instead of, if you try to organize a factory in Honduras, even if you could, then the Gap would simply say, well, I'll put my investment in some other country. I'll use a factory elsewhere as opposed to Honduras. So point of production organizing, I don't think works too well. But I do think that point of consumption organizing can make a difference, because people ultimately have to buy goods. Now that's tricky, but one of the things that the LA Jewish Commission on Sweatshop tried to do was to develop a line of what we jokingly called kosher clothing. Now you know that in the Jewish faith, kosher food is blessed by a rabbi, and then people pay all sorts of extra money to eat kosher, sort of like the health food industry. So we reasoned if we could come up with some suppliers who would use union labor, pay people, open their factories, do everything we wanted, maybe we could get Nordstrom's to have a rack of clothing which was in the sweat-free zone. We approached Nordstrom's, and Nordstrom's, well, first they said nobody would pay a premium for that. And then they gave us their real reason, which is if we have a rack of sweat-free clothing, what does it say about everything else in the store? So they weren't interested. But I do think that in the long run it should be possible to put pressure on manufacturers through opening up. I do think that creating transparency is the first step. And the collegiate licensing sector is a $3 billion industry. It's the tip of the iceberg, but it's a start. Also, uniforms, things that school districts buy, things that city and county government buy. All these are places, I think, to begin. But ultimately, it's my belief that the pendulum will swing back, and eventually workers in China will unionize. They're starting to complain already. And so, maybe 50 years from now, workers around the world will, somehow been able to exert some power. I mean, right now there's a huge power imbalance. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the best I can do. Yes?
I want to follow up on your last answer. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on the various listservs related to solidarity movements, whether in Central America, the Campaign for Labor Rights and others, about the relationship between a consumers movement of people who have more privileges, et cetera, in countries like the United States, and workers' rights. So how do you wrestle with the relationship between solidarity and support and benevolence?
Well, I'm in favor of both of them. That's an excellent question, and one that the student movement has had to grapple with. I'll tell you a little story. Charles Kernaghan is head of the National Labor Committee. He's a very controversial guy, kind of a loose cannon, but he is one of my heroes. He has single-handedly done as much as any human being to track these things. He made Kathy Lee cry on national television, and that alone counts for something in my book. Well, last year, that's because she was employing an underage Honduran, I think, worker to make clothing, the label of which said a percentage of the profits go to help the children of the world. A bit of irony there. And now Kernaghan, a couple of years ago, went with a delegation of students to investigate some factories. I think it was in Guatemala, could have been Nicaragua, I can't remember. And one of the things they did was on camera, they interviewed some union organizers who were doing this illegally, of course, and at great peril. They then tried to force their way into a factory so they could actually get some video of a factory, and their cameras were seized, the film was looked at, and the union organizers who were seen on the film had to flee the country out of fear of their lives. So part of your question is the benevolent motivation that comes from a privileged position has to be checked. The way the Worker Rights Consortium, the student-led movement, has done this is as follows. Some pilot projects are being set up over the next year in the collegiate licensing sector, the collegiate clothing sector. And the idea is to build contacts with human rights groups in, for example, San Salvador, I mean, 3 or 4 countries will be chosen where there's a good infrastructure of groups. And our role will be to do research, to raise money, to train people, but the work has to be done on the ground by local people who have the confidence of the workers who come from their communities. So it is tricky. You can't just barge in from the global north and solve people's problems. Other questions? Why don't we take a couple more questions and then we'll sell thousands of books. Okay.
I spoke to the president of the Automobile Labor Union in Brazil, and I asked him a question. Why it didn't bother him to hire young kids to work at the factories? And then he looked at me and said, what do you prefer, kids to be on the streets, starving, robbing people, so on and so forth, or working at a living wage, which I think he was not really referring to the living wage. But anyhow, do you describe anything like that on your book?
Yeah, well, here, I'll read you one quote from the book very quickly. This quote is from George Randall. George Randall was the founder of Yes, with an exclamation point. Yes was a company, as its name implies, it was upbeat, and it pioneered the use of slinky spandex in women's bodysuits and things like that. And at the time I interviewed George Randall, Yes was flying high. And George was a guy who could do anything. He had been a prisoner of war in Korea during the Korean War in a Chinese camp. He'd done this, done that, and so on. George said this: I am a product of sweatshops. I created them. I love them. Sweatshops kept families together, and they still do. My wife put her kids in a cardboard box next to her in a sweatshop. Now she runs a $20 million business. You have to choose to be downtrodden. Hard work, choice, that's the key. Anyone can make it. There are no excuses. I work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but I also play hard. Choice. Don't ever forget about it. Everything else is bullshit. These guys gave great interviews, let me tell you. You know, that is the idea. These people are better off than they would be otherwise. Why else would they be working here? I made it. I bootstrapped myself. There's a grain of truth in that. Obviously, you know, the women who work in those factories in Brazil, if they would be on the streets as teenagers, preyed upon, they're better off earning money. They would be better off still if they were in school. But the argument that the world that exists wouldn't exist unless it were the best of all possible worlds is self-defeating. It was used to fight every effort by American labor, or labor throughout the world, to unionize. And it's been used today. I mean, for example, I don't think that you could move to a living wage in El Salvador tomorrow that would result in quadrupling the wages of garment workers. And, you know, they'd be making more money than professors probably. Might be a good thing, I don't know. But you can have that as a goal, and you can simultaneously try to create a living wage in this country. You know, there's a living wage group in Santa Barbara which is working on that. If you raise the bar everywhere, you know, then there won't be this global race to the bottom where businesses scour the earth for the cheapest labor possible. So, you know, and also I just have to say I think there's a moral position to be taken. You know, I don't think it is right to pay people starvation wages. And, you know, I don't think that we have to stand for that. Okay, well, it's now exactly 5 o'clock. So thank you all very much. Be happy to take more questions.